shadow of your wings I'll stay. You're my refuge, I won't be afraid. My dwelling place, my dwelling place. And I will sing your praises. Oh, I will sing your praises. I will wake the dawn. I will wake the dawn. Oh, you hide me when danger comes my way. Beneath the shadow of your wings I'll stay. You're my refuge, I won't be afraid. My dwelling place. Oh, you hide me when danger comes my way. Beneath the shadow of your wings I'll stay. You're my refuge, I won't be afraid. My dwelling place, my dwelling place. Ooh, my dwelling place. Ooh.
All right. Welcome. Hope you enjoyed your time together over lunch. And let's follow up. I want to pick up today where I left off last night. I didn't quite finish the third chapter. My wife informed me that I spent the whole night talking about crossing the Jordan, and then I didn't let them cross. So let's go back to the third chapter and just pick up where we left off and finish there. Verse 7, chapter 3. Now the Lord said to Joshua, "This day I will begin to exalt you in the sight of all Israel, so that they will know that just as I have been with Moses, I will be with you. So you shall command the priests who are carrying the ark of the covenant, saying, when you come to the edge of the waters of the Jordan, you shall stand still in the Jordan." Then Joshua said to the sons of Israel, "Come here and hear the words of the Lord your God." And Joshua said, "By this you will know that the living God is among you, and that he will assuredly drive out from you the Canaanite, the Hittite, the Hivite, the Perizzite, the Girgashite, the Amorite, and the Jebusite. Behold, the ark of the covenant of the Lord of all the earth is crossing over ahead of you into the Jordan. Now then, take for yourselves 12 men from the tribes of Israel, one man for each tribe. And it will come about when the soles of the feet of the priests who carry the ark of the Lord of all the earth, rest in the waters of the Jordan waters of the Jordan will be cut off. That is, the waters which are flowing down from above, and they will stand in one heap. So when the people set out from their tents to cross the Jordan, with the priests carrying the ark of the covenant before the people, and when those who were carrying the ark came up to the Jordan, and the feet of the priests carrying the ark stepped down into the edge of the water, for the Jordan overflows all its banks all the days of harvest, then the waters which were flowing down from above stood and rose up in one heap, a great distance away at Adam, the city that is beside Zarethan, and those which were flowing down toward the sea of the Arabah, the salt sea, were completely cut off. So the people crossed opposite Jericho, and the priests who carried the ark of the covenant of the Lord stood firm on dry ground in the middle of the Jordan, while all Israel crossed on dry ground. It's pretty fascinating, this story, because there are some practical lessons here. Joshua gives instructions that the ark of the Lord will lead the way. That is consistent with everything that we've seen. This is all about God, and it's all about building the faith of the people as they trust God. And so that implicit confidence, that trust that God is over all things, is expressed a couple of different ways. You might have noticed that both in verse 11 and then again in verse, there's a couple of places in this chapter where he mentions the Lord of all the earth. He doesn't just speak about God in some general sense. He emphasizes, as they are about to set foot for the first time in the land of promise, the land that will require their conquest, he speaks about the Lord of all the earth. That is significant because the people are being reminded that in contrast to the multiple gods of the Canaanites, they serve the one God who is over all the earth. Ancient gods were typically seen as territorial. There could be a different god for each city, a different god certainly for each nation, and the extent of the power of that god was generally assumed to be bounded by the borders of a particular nation or the walls of a city. And so that's why it was always considered to be so dangerous to travel in the ancient world, because as soon as you passed out from under the care of the God that you served, you were sort of left at the mercy of other nations who had other gods. Israel is constantly reminded that our God is not geographically limited. He is not bound by any kind of limitations. He is the Lord of all the earth. And that gave them confidence. It didn't matter what city they were marching against, what tribe they were facing. It didn't matter what gods those tribes brought into the battle, because their God was the supreme God. They focused on his revelation to the point that they followed the instructions that they had been given precisely. That's in verses 9, 12, and 13. Well, what were those instructions? Well, here's what they were told. Remember, they've been camped on the side of the Jordan River for 3 days. It was at flood tide, and it was rushing past. They didn't have boats. They didn't have a bridge. How are we going to get across that river? Well, here's Joshua's instruction. We're going to march right through it. I'm sorry, what? We're not only going to march right through it, but here's the way we're going to march through it. The priests, as was their assignment, they are going to carry the Ark of the Covenant, the mercy seat, the throne of God. As the king of Israel, in effect, he will lead us into the field of battle. Now, here's the part of this I love. He said, I want you to carry the ark until the soles of your feet, meaning the soles of the feet of all of the priests that were carrying the ark. There probably would have been, I can't remember, 6 or 8 of them. As they carry this out and they stand, he goes, step into the water. It's only when they're in the water that the miracle happens. The water is blocked upstream and it stops flowing. Now, one of the lessons here that I love is that when God calls us to do something, he wants us, first of all, to focus on him because he is the source of whatever's going to happen. I mean, he's the source of our power. He is the source of our success. He wants us to focus on his word. He wants us to recognize that his presence is with us. But here's the part that we often don't think about. He wants to stretch us to the limits of our obedience. See, he didn't just say walk down near the water. He didn't just say stay in your tents until you see the water stop and then hustle up and get across. He said walk down there until your feet are wet. And it was only when they showed the faith to step out into a roaring river that God said, okay, that's what I was looking for. He's going to take them to the extent of their ability to obey. He's going to press them to the full limits. And they were supposed to have the patience for an intervention of God. You know, sometimes miracles take a good little while to unfold. I'm sometimes bothered when I hear people who sort of demand miracles. They use different kinds of language. They claim it. They declare it. First of all, we don't have the authority to put a quarter in the machine and expect God to jump through hoops according to what we want him to do. But second of all, even when God has assured us that he's going to do something, he's still going to do it on his timetable. Miracles happen in God's good pleasure. And here he had told them, I'm going to make it possible for you to cross over. But those priests, can you imagine the privilege of carrying the ark? But the privilege of carrying the ark brought with it the requirement that you had a courageous faith even more than the people. See, the people are going to watch all of this, but by the time they start to cross over, the water has stopped. But those priests, you ever been in a river or a flow of water that's really moving rapidly? Even on the edge of that, I mean, without getting out too deep into the middle, even on the edge of it, when you step out into that, there's a real pull. There's a real tug. If you've ever been in the ocean and you've had that undertow, makes it hard to stand up. March out there and get your feet wet, not your toes. I want the soles of your feet to be underwater. And then it happened. God stepped in and he stopped the water and the flow diminished to nothing. They knew where it had happened. They could tell you the distance away where the water was cut off. Verse 19, the priest who carried the ark of the covenant of the Lord stood firm on dry ground in the middle of the Jordan, while all Israel crossed on dry ground until the nation had finished crossing the Jordan. Well, here's the thing. God is giving them a supernatural entrance into the land of conquest. Because, see, everything that he's done so far, everything that we've seen, from his reassurances to Joshua, to even going all the way back to Deuteronomy 20, the instructions that Moses gave about how to enter into battle, well before the days of battle had arrived. They had been in preparation by God and the leaders that God had appointed now for years. But even now, with everything that they've been prepared to accomplish, God still gives them miraculous entry into the promised land. Why? Because he wanted them to have one more reminder that he was the one who was going to fight the battle. The conquest was his. Now, we're going to see that approach play out even as we get to the first legitimate battle that happens in the land of conquest. But let's look at chapter 4 first, because before we're ready to go to battle, there is a pause to create a memorial. Chapter 4, verse 1. Now, when the entire nation had finished crossing the Jordan, the Lord spoke to Joshua, saying, "Take for yourselves 12 men from the people, 1 man from each tribe, and command them, saying, Take up for yourselves 12 stones from here out of the middle of the Jordan, from the place where the priest's feet were standing firmly, and carry them over with you, and lay them down in the encampment where you will spend the night." Okay, the priests march out into the water flow stops, the priests go to the middle of the Jordan, and they stand there with the ark. The nation now begins to march across the river, and every single citizen of the nation of Israel is going to pass the ark on the way across. They get there, and now they're all on the other side. And here's the instruction. Take 12 boulders that had probably never been seen by human beings because they were in the middle of that river. Take 12 boulders from right there in the deepest part of the river where the priests had been standing with the ark. Get 1 man from each tribe. You see, that symbolizes that all 12 tribes were represented, this was an act that represented all of the people. Get 12 men, 1 from each tribe, go back to the middle of the river, and I want them to pick up a boulder and carry it to the side that they're now on. Verse 4. So Joshua called the 12 men whom he had appointed from the sons of Israel, 1 man from each tribe. And Joshua said to them, "Cross again to the ark of the Lord your God into the middle of the Jordan, and each of you take up a stone on his shoulder according to the number of the tribes of the sons of Israel." The priests are still standing out in the middle. The water hasn't started flowing. The people have now arrived on the other side, but Joshua takes 12 representatives and sends them back to where the priests are to get these boulders. Verse 6, this shall be a sign among you when your children ask later, saying, "What do these stones mean to you?" Then you shall say to them that the waters of the Jordan were cut off before the ark of the covenant of the Lord. When it crossed the Jordan, the waters of the Jordan were cut off. So these stones shall become a memorial to the sons of Israel forever. Now, what happens is they're going to take stones out of the middle of the river. They're going to carry them to the shore, and they're going to stack them. It is not an elaborate monument. It is not painted and decorated with baubles and fancy things, but it is an odd enough structure to cause curiosity. 12 pretty sizable stones packed up on top of each other along the side of this river. It was designed to cause people to ask, what's that for? It's clearly not a natural formation. It didn't happen by accident. Somebody put those stones there. What's the story? What's the backstory behind this collection of stones stacked onto each other? There are 2 words that are used in this chapter. First, it says that this will be a sign. A sign is a portent or a pledge of something concerning the future. The stones were stacked up so they would call attention to Israel's hearts by way of their eyes rather than their ears. In a sense, it was a sermon in stone. Marking the place of the miraculous crossing, it was meant to point to the promise of the care and the miracles that were still to come. It was a sign. A sign is something here that points to something not yet. But at the same time, he then uses a different word. He says this will be a memorial. A memorial is a reminder of God's good work in the past. You see, judgment is now behind them. For 40 years, even now that the generation that had been judged unacceptable for the promised land, they're dead and buried. They're decaying in the desert. But there was something about the desert, about the wilderness, that every day reminded them that they were still suffering under the judgment of God for faithlessness as a nation. This memorial was really designed to perpetually commemorate the moment where they moved out from under judgment and found their way into a new era where God was going to act mightily on their behalf. It's the same pile of stones, and yet as a memorial, it looks backward to what we left behind, and as a sign, it looks forward to what is going to happen. Now, in the New Testament, we refer to these kinds of rituals, these signs and memorials, we call them ordinances. We practice two ordinances in our theological tradition. They are baptism and the Lord's Supper. Both rituals are both memorials and signs. Baptism, for example, is a reminder that we have died to ourselves because Christ secured the opportunity for us to be made right with Christ. It is a memorial as we lay our lives down and talk about the work of God in our lives. But we are raised to new life, which is a mark of anticipation about everything that God has in store for us ahead. The Lord's Supper is exactly the same thing. The Lord's Supper is, we call it a memorial. We call it a remembrance. The Lord's Supper is to push our minds backwards to the broken body, to the spilled blood of Jesus Christ, who by his sacrifice on the cross secured the ability for us to be made right with God, to be forgiven, to be brought into the kingdom as citizens, as members of the family of God. But in the same way that Jesus, in that first Passover night, where the Lord's Supper was transformed out of the Passover, Jesus said, I'm not going to drink this again until you join me at the marriage supper. What Zechariah, on Sunday, we looked at that text, what Zechariah calls the inauguration banquet. In the New Testament, it's called the marriage supper of the Lamb. So the Lord's Supper is to push our minds backwards to remember the body and the blood of Christ, what was necessary in order for us to be made right with him. But the very fact that Jesus said, I'm not going to do this again until you do it with me, it pushes us forward in anticipation of what's still to come for us, of what he has in store for us, of all the promises that are still to be fulfilled in our lives and in human history. Throughout the Bible, these kinds of things happen all the time. God is a God who loves the virtue of memory, but he's also a God that loves anticipation. Let me just quickly give you a couple of examples. In Genesis chapter 28, you have Jacob at Bethel, where he builds a monument that is both a memorial of where he has been and what God has done in his life, and a sign of what is coming in what God has in store for him. In Exodus 12, we have the implementation by Moses of the first Passover. that Passover meal, that night in Egypt when the blood had been painted over the doorposts of the homes, and covered by that blood, Israel was safe from the angel of death, who took the eldest born human being and animal across the nation of Egypt. That Passover on an annual basis was a memorial of what God had done that night to secure their release from slavery, but it was a sign of what God had in store for his people. To be covered by the blood meant that there was something else that was going to unfold. Well, after the period of the conquest, if we go forward far enough to 1 Samuel chapter 7, you have Mizpah. Mizpah was a memorial that Samuel established after Israel had defeated what was at that time their greatest enemies, the Philistines. And he built a memorial he built a monument as a memorial. We need to remember what God has done, but as a sign, because what God has done should always push us into anticipation of what God is going to do. That's why chapter 4 is given here. It'd be easy to say, well, let's go from chapter 3, they cross over the river. Let's jump right to chapter 6. That's where the next battle takes place at Jericho. There's a reason why 4 and 5 are included in this book. 4 is the establishment of this sign/memorial, this monument meant to create an opportunity for parents to tell their children the stories. It was designed to prevent forgetfulness. 2 entire chapters devoted to these events show that it had ongoing significance. This was a moment in time for that generation. God wants his people to remember what he has done. He wants us to remember inclusively, meaning all the things that he's done. He wants us to remember conspicuously. Listen, part of the reason that parents sometimes are not good about handing off the faith is that they think that if they just take their kids to church, that they'll just sort of pick it up by osmosis. If you go all the way back to the 6th chapter of Deuteronomy, Israel sets the standard by which all people of faith are supposed to follow in every generation, and that is, you have to be intentional. You have to be conspicuous about telling the stories and explaining what God has done in your family, in your life. That a child needs more than just church attendance. He needs that kind of conspicuous reminder to prevent forgetfulness about the faithfulness of God. I heard a speaker tell a story one time. He had been invited to a church to preach for their 100th anniversary as a church. And one of the men came to him and said, "We're glad that you're here today, but please tell me that you're not going to spend the whole time just being nostalgic and looking backward." And he said, I'm not. I'm going to look backward and I'm going to look forward. But the way you asked that question, let me remind you of something. There's the only thing worse than nostalgia is amnesia. You see, that's why for our 25th anniversary just a few weeks ago, for our 20th anniversary 5 years ago, for each significant anniversary that we stop, we look backwards, because what God has done among a people called Evergreen is not just an encouragement. It is a place that we stand with confidence, because what God has done here then pushes us to anticipate what he still intends to do. These chapters are deeply important just for that reason. Prevents forgetfulness. It promotes unity. One man from each tribe participated, and it really was designed to prepare the next generation. This generation that's crossing over into the promised land, they are already losing the first-person accounts of their time in Egypt. In order for the confidence of a God who could take them out of slavery, in order for that to be passed on, the stories had to be passed on. They had to know what God had done in such dramatic ways. Now, in chapter 5, we're not going to spend a lot of time here, but there's something interesting that I just want you to see quickly. In verse 1 of chapter 5, it says, "Now it came about when all the kings of the Amorites who were beyond," all the kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan to the west, and all the kings of the Canaanites who were by the sea, heard how the Lord had dried up the waters of the Jordan before the sons of Israel until they had crossed, their hearts melted. And there was no spirit in them any longer because of the sons of Israel." Listen, I told you, we learned from Rahab that the Canaanites were very much aware that the Israelites were coming. They knew where they were. They knew when they moved down to camp beside the river. They knew that camping beside the river meant that at some point, although they probably thought it would be later in the year when the river had receded to a lower level, it wasn't safe. They probably felt a little bit secure right now, because obviously Israel isn't going to cross the river when it's raging at its highest level. So they probably thought they still had a few months to prepare. And then, lo and behold, the lookouts that had been established on their side of the river, they came back and said, "You are not going to believe this. The water stopped dead in its tracks." And that entire nation, not just their army. We're told in verses that we didn't read that they had about 40,000 men prepared as soldiers to go into battle. But not just their army, their women and children, they walked across on dry land. And because of the mighty acts of God on behalf of Israel, the Canaanite kings and the other tribal kings in the area, their hearts melted. This is not going to go well for us. This God repeatedly does things that none of our gods can do. And so, here we find Israel again. Joshua, it says that God is going to cause the people to esteem Joshua just as much as they had esteem for Moses. It's a reminder that God has raised up Joshua, and he's going to make the people follow him and really acknowledge his greatness the same way they did with Moses. Now that, you say, well, why is God constantly sort of coming back to Joshua to remind him? I'll tell you exactly why. Because Joshua's faith is not initially displayed by great military ventures, by typical kinds of leadership accomplishments. Look at what his faith is called to do. He's called to assemble the people to go across a river that looks uncrossable. And then, think about this. They cross over, but it's not just the army. It's all the women and children. It's all the families. They are now, on the day after they cross, for the first time in 40 years, they are going to spend the night in enemy territory. But not just their army, their women and their little ones. I mean, if you're Joshua and your goal is to be seen as a great military commander, the last thing you're going to do is put your people in a position where they are at a military disadvantage. They now have Jericho and the armies of the enemy on one side of them, and a river that has now returned to flood stage. They're not in a good strategic position. We crossed over. It was pretty impressive, but what is Joshua thinking? Shouldn't he have sent the army to battle and only brought the people over maybe a few months from now, after we've established some footholds here and some ways, some cities, maybe we capture some cities so that we have a place to put our families? But see, that's not what God told him to do. God said, I'm going to push you to the extent of your obedience, and I want you to follow my precise instructions. But here's the thing. You do that, doesn't matter what people think, doesn't matter if they think that you've lost your mind. You do precisely what I tell you and trust your reputation to me. They're going to esteem you, but they're going to ultimately esteem you not for the typical things that make a military commander popular. They're going to esteem you because they're going to see that you followed the Lord your God so completely, so precisely, that he acted on behalf of his people every time, and they were safe. They are not in a good position militarily, except it's Joshua's job to continually remind them that they are God's people and that he goes before them. Now, here's what has to happen. You'd think, okay, the city of Jericho, they've clearly been reinforcing, and we'll see that when we get to that chapter 6. We see that the city of Jericho, they have been building their supplies. They've been securing their walls. They know a battle is coming. They've been getting ready for it. But as I say, they were probably a little bit caught off guard that it was coming as quickly as it was, because they probably thought they had a few months until a different season when the people could more readily cross the river. They find out that Israel has crossed, so war is going to be upon them, and so they are hustling up to finish their preparations. You would think, again, from a human standpoint, Joshua's strategy would be, they're not ready for us. Let's go right now. Let's seize the moment. We've got the element of surprise in a sense. They know we're coming, but we've caught them off guard because we're sooner than they anticipated. Let's take advantage of what advantage we may have in this moment. No, that's not the way God works. Look at verse 2. At that time, the Lord said to Joshua, make for yourself flint knives and circumcise again the sons of Israel the second time. So Joshua made himself flint knives and circumcised the sons of Israel at Gibeath Haaralot. This is the reason why Joshua circumcised them. All the people who came out of Egypt who were males, all the men of war, died in the wilderness along the way after they came out of Egypt. For all the people who came out were circumcised, but all the people who were born in the wilderness along the way as they came out of Egypt had not been circumcised. For the sons of Israel walked 40 years in the wilderness until all the nation, that is, the men of war who came out of Egypt, perished because they did not listen to the voice of the Lord, to whom the Lord had sworn that he would not let them see the land which the Lord had sworn to their fathers to give us, a land flowing with milk and honey. So their children, whom he raised up in their place, Joshua circumcised, for they were uncircumcised because they had not circumcised them along the way. Now when they had finished circumcising all the nation, they remained in their places in the camp until they recovered. The dumbest thing that you can do in this moment, when you are at a military disadvantage with a river behind you and an enemy in front of you, is put every soldier in your army on sick leave. But you see, circumcision wasn't just a physical procedure. It was a statement of ownership. Israel was charged originally to circumcise themselves because it was a mark that they had accepted in their body, a permanent sign that they were different from all of the nations around them. They were owned, if you will, by the true God. Now, because they had gotten lax about practicing this particular custom while they were in the wilderness, now that they were in the promised land, God says, okay, I brought you across the river miraculously. We've built a monument, a memorial of where you've been. You're out of judgment. It's a sign of where you're headed. But we've got to take care of some unfinished business. I want you to renew your commitment to the covenant that I made with your founding fathers. I want this generation to take on themselves the mark that says we belong to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now again, human standpoint, not a smart move. But Joshua is not fighting this fight from a human standpoint. If God is going to win the battle, if God is going to display his will and his might on behalf of his people, it is not unfair of God to say, my expectation is that my people are faithful in all of the things that I've instructed them to do. So they take time. They take both time to circumcise all of the males across the nation that are uncircumcised, and then they just stay there for however long it took to recover from that uncomfortable procedure. Listen, circumcision for a newborn in the hospital, not a big deal. Circumcision for a 40-year-old man, big deal. They decided that before they go into battle, it was important that they make sure that their obedience is up to date. In a sense, they have to decide that they have to. You remember how before they first got to the river, the instruction was consecrate yourself for 3 days? That's what this is. This is another aspect of making sure that you are in a right place in your walk with God. Part of the problem, occasionally over the years, I've had this situation a few times. I do premarital counseling, and I'm going to do a wedding for a couple, and I find out that they've been that they've crossed boundaries physically before their wedding. And my advice is always the same. I say, okay, this is not an unforgivable sin, but here's what I want you to do. I want you to separate, and I want you to make sure that you don't cross this boundary between now and your wedding. I want you to dedicate yourself to being right with God, and I want you to draw boundaries for your behavior, and I don't want you to cross those boundaries again. And I've had people say, well, essentially it's the argument that says, well, the cat's out of the bag. What does it matter now? I say, here's why it matters. You're coming to a pastor to officiate your wedding, and you want to have the wedding in a church. I assume that because you want a pastor and you want a church, I assume that you want God to bless the union that you're making in your wedding ceremony. Yeah, we want that. Okay, well, here's what you're missing. You can't ask God to bless your relationship when you have declared without apology that you're going to live that relationship in a way that dishonors God. You see, consecration is this process of saying, I want God to do amazing things. I want to be in on that. But God doesn't jump, he doesn't dance to our tune. We walk according to his plan. And so a lot of times when we're praying for a miracle, we say, oh God, I need a new job. God, I've got to get out of this financial crisis. God, I have a medical issue. I have a relationship issue. I'm struggling with my kids or my in-laws, or I've got these, I need you to step in and intervene. What we never stop and say is, before I call God in to try and bail me out of a difficult situation, have I done the inventory of my walk with God so that I know that I've repented of habits and behaviors that dishonor him, that I have been careful to make sure that I'm not just asking God to bless me when I'm dishonoring him in the way that I'm doing things. This business of consecration is not just some sort of formal thing that we do as a church in a corporate setting periodically before we're going to have some event or some meeting. This is a process of saying, God, I don't want there to be anything in my life that hinders your willingness to step in and show yourself mighty on my behalf. This circumcision wasn't just a religious ritual. This is Israel saying, we can't take another step into enemy territory if God doesn't go with us. So we want to make sure there's not anything that's fixable on our part that we don't turn our attention to, so that God is free to pour out blessings on his people. Well, they go through this time of recommitment. Verse 10, they celebrate the Passover. It's the first time they've celebrated the Passover in the land of promise. Because remember, the Passover, it was implemented in Egypt 40 years before. When they left slavery, they've celebrated it in the wilderness, but they've never celebrated it in the promised land. So that's what they do. After the circumcision event, they turn their attention to the Passover, again, a reminder of what God has done for them, an anticipation of what is coming. It says that when they ate the Passover, the day after the Passover, they took some of the produce of the land and they used that. They made cakes out of it, they roasted the grain, and the day that they had a meal that was provided by the bounty of the promised land, verse 12 says, and the manna ceased on the day after they had eaten some of the produce of the land, so that the sons of Israel no longer had manna, but they ate some of the yield of the land of Canaan during that year. Listen, sometimes we get into such a comfort zone that we can't recall that the things that God is doing for us were never meant to be permanent. Can you imagine? There had to be somebody in that citizenry the day that they went out for the first time in their lives, and they go, wait, something's different. There's no manna on the ground. What are we going to do? Listen, manna was never meant to be permanent. Manna was a temporary provision of God until He put you in a place where He had something better for you. They were supposed to live off of this land that was flowing with milk and honey. But I'm sure when the manna went away, there's some people that started wringing their hands. They started wondering what was going to happen. Listen, when God takes away what is meant to be a temporary comfort, it's because He has now brought you to the place that He really wanted you to be at all the time. And we don't bemoan the loss of the temporary comfort. We celebrate. Man, when manna stopped falling, they were supposed to take that as a sign that we're home. We're going to plant crops. We're going to raise cattle. We're going to grow food. And we're going to do it on our own land. We're not in the desert any longer. We're not wandering in the wilderness. We're home. And nothing is better than the food that you grew on your land. That's the way they were supposed to see this. The temporary support was taken away, but it was because they were now in the land that they had been promised. Verse 13, now it came about when Joshua was by Jericho, he raised his eyes and looked, and behold, a man was standing opposite him with his sword drawn in his hand. And Joshua went to him and said to him, are you for us or for our enemies? He said, no, rather I have come now as captain of the army of the Lord. And Joshua fell on his face to the ground and bowed down and said to him, what has my Lord to say to his servant? And the captain of the Lord's army said to Joshua, remove your sandals from your feet, for the place where you are standing is holy. And Joshua did so. This is an interesting little sidebar inserted in the story. But look at chapter 5, why this is so significant. In chapter 5, we have the circumcision of all the males of Israel. That is, they were making themselves right before God before proceeding. The circumcision event is followed by the discontinuation of the manna, a reminder that the promises that God had made so long before are now being fulfilled. They're home. Followed by, now see, they're about to go to Jericho. They know that there's a battle just literally over the next hill. But God shows up again with the angel of the Lord who says, I'm the commander of the armies of the Lord. Listen, you don't think, have you seen that scene in Lord of the Rings where Gandalf leaves and and they're in Helm's Deep, and they're getting ready to fight a battle that they're probably going to lose. And Gandalf says, on the fifth day, look to the east. And he arrives on the fifth day at the most desperate moment in the battle, and they look up, and coming over the top of the hill is Gandalf with thousands of reinforcements. Joshua, he's done everything that he's been told to do. But I'm telling you, his faith is strong. He's a man of God. But they've never set siege to a walled city before. You know what Joshua needed more than anything right then? He needed to look up, and he needed to see supernatural reinforcements. And God condescended to him to give him one last encounter to remind him, you lead your army, the Lord of armies will lead his army, and this will be a piece of cake. Well, so that brings us to Jericho. Look at chapter 6. Now Jericho was tightly shut because of the sons of Israel. That is, they had closed up the city. They had made all their preparations for war because they knew Israel was coming. No one went out and no one came in. But the Lord said to Joshua, see, I have handed Jericho over to you with its king and all the valiant warriors. Now, I love that because God has a habit of speaking in the past tense before he does things. Because once God has decided something, it's as good as done. I have handed Jericho over to you with its king and the valiant warriors. Now, look at this situation. They march up to Jericho. It's finally in sight. The natural man says, ooh, that city is shut up tight. We're not catching them off guard. They're ready for us. The natural man puts his confidence in the walls, or his fear of those walls. Jericho, filled with ungodly men, they trusted their walls. Ungodly Israelites would have been put to fear by the walls. But here there is a spiritual believer who is charged to see invisible realities. The eyes of faith are often invited to see victory way before physical eyes can see it. That's why the visit at the end of chapter 5 by the commander of the Lord's armies, and that's why God speaks in verse 2 in the past tense. Well, so here's the plan. Joshua, by the way, he's still waiting for the exact battle plan. And here we go. Verse 3. And you shall march around the city, all the men of war, circling the city once. You shall do so for 6 days. Wait, that's it? That's the plan? Verse 4. Oh, there's something else. Also, 7 priests shall carry 7 trumpets of ram's horns in front of the ark. Then on the 7th day you shall march around the city 7 times, and the priests shall blow the trumpets. Okay, so we march out to battle. We march around the city, following the ark, and then we come back to camp. And we march out to battle and march around the city, following the ark, and come back to camp. And then we do it again, and then we do it again, and then we do it again. And you know, the soldiers in Jericho, they're up on the wall. They're watching all this happen. The VeggieTales story with the peas shouting taunts down on the children of Israel, that's not far from the way the story unfolded. Every time Israel marches around the city and then goes back to camp, it was a little bit more boldness in the city of Jericho, because I promise you, their take on this is they're looking for a way in and they can't find it. We're safe. They don't know what to do. They've never encountered a city like ours. They can't defeat us. On the 7th day, something's different. Wait a minute. They're not going back to camp. Oh, they're marching around again. Oh, they're marching around again. Oh, they're marching around again. This is where the story gets really good. Let's see, verse 7. Then Joshua said to the people, go forward and march around the city, and the armed men shall go on ahead of the ark of the Lord. And it was so that when Joshua had spoken to the people, the 7 priests carrying the 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the Lord went forward and blew the trumpets, and the ark of the covenant and the Lord followed them. The ark of the covenant of the Lord followed them. And the armed men went ahead of the priests who blew the trumpets, and the rear guard came after the ark while they continued to blow the trumpets. So Joshua commanded the people, saying, you shall not shout, nor let your voice be heard, nor let a word proceed from your mouth until the day I tell you shout. Then you shall shout. So he had the ark of the Lord taken around the city, circling it once. Then they came into the camp and spent the night in the camp. Okay, this is the other part. He's given the people the command that they are not only to follow the ark, they are not only to have the priests carry ram's horns, which frankly was kind of a rustic wilderness kind of means of communication. I mean, a city with technology and advancements like Jericho, they would have laughed at those ram's horns. I mean, that's kind of what the country bumpkins use. They follow the ark, they carry ram's horns, but here's the thing. The people are told to be completely silent while they're marching. And notice, there's no explanation given here. They're not told why to be silent, but they're said, you don't talk, you don't shout, you don't make any noise. Jericho probably interpreted that as the fact that Israel was probably overwhelmed by the situation into speechlessness. They march around the city, nothing happened, no evidence of God. They go back to the camp. The next day, no change in their procedure. They looked like complete fools for 6 days in a row, 12 trips. They went out to the city, they marched back from the city. This is the most remarkable example of united obedience maybe in the entire Bible. An entire nation following these simple but very precise instructions. Well, here we go. On day, let's see, second day, okay, verse 15. Then on the 7th day, they got up early at the dawning of the day and marched around the city in the same way 7 times. Only on that day did they march around the city 7 times. And at the 7th time, when the priests blew the trumpets, Joshua said to the people, shout, for the Lord has given you the city. But the city shall be designated for destruction. It and everything that is in it belongs to the Lord. Only Rahab the prostitute and all who are with her in the house shall live, because she hid the messengers whom we sent. But as for you, only keep yourselves from the things designated for destruction, so that you do not covet them, and take some of the designated things and turn the camp of Israel into something designated for destruction and bring disaster on it. But all the silver and gold and the articles of bronze and iron are holy to the Lord. They shall go into the treasury of the Lord. So the people shouted, the priests blew the trumpets, and when the people heard the sound of the trumpet, the people shouted with a great shout, and the wall fell down flat, so that the people went up into the city, everyone straight ahead, and they took the city. Okay. Now here's the instruction. You might say, well, what is this business about not touching any of the loot, the booty of conquering a city? Wasn't it normal for a conquering army to take all the wealth of a city to take it to themselves? Absolutely, that's right. What Israel is being reminded of here is it's not our army that's going to defeat this city. Every part of what's valuable in that city, the spoils of war, if you will, they belong only to the Lord, because it is His army that is going to win this battle. It was important for Israel, the first significant battle they have in the Promised Land, a walled city like Jericho. It was important that they win. I mean, Can you imagine losing your very first time out of the gate? It was important that they win, but it was more important that they see God win. And by reserving the spoils of the battle for the treasury of the tabernacle, it was an acknowledgement on the part of Israel that we didn't do this. You see, one of the most dangerous things that an individual or a church, for example, can do is when God does something extraordinary, when we take credit for his actions. That is a dangerous place to be. Why? Because God doesn't share credit. It's not that he needs the ego boost. That's not what's going on here. The reason God doesn't share credit is because God, better than we understand, God understands that when we take credit for his actions, it produces in us pride, which becomes an infectious disease that is very difficult to recover from. God demands that we give credit to him because it is in our long-term best interest in our spirits to have a right relationship and understand who does what, who gets credit, and who is the answer to our needs. Israel's been given these instructions, okay? Here they go. It's time to march out, but as they're going to surround the city, when the walls fall, you're not going to have to go sideways. Every soldier is going to be able to go straight ahead from where they are. The whole city is going to be gone, with the only exception of probably a small piece that made up the outside wall of Rahab's house. And the two spies that knew her, that would recognize her, Joshua says, go find her, bring all of her family out. Those are the only ones that are going to be reserved from this battle. Okay? Let's see. Okay. The city wall fell down flat so that the people went up into the city, everyone straight ahead, and they took the city. They utterly destroyed everything in the city, both man and woman, young and old, and ox, sheep, and donkey with the edge of the sword. Now that verse bothers people. This is what we're going to talk about tomorrow, both in preparation for the study that I'm doing on Wednesday nights in Judges, as well as the rest of the book of Joshua. We've got to answer this thorny question about why God demanded complete destruction of these nations. So don't miss tomorrow because we're going to grapple with that, and I'm going to show you the biblical answer, because this is probably the number one attack on the Word of God in our culture. That the Old Testament God is bloodthirsty, he's genocidal, he's hateful and mean-spirited. Tomorrow we'll deal with this. They bring out Rahab, they bring out her family that is with her, they spare her. And then, verse 26, Joshua made them take an oath at that time, saying, cursed before the Lord is the man who rises up and builds this city, Jericho. With the loss of his firstborn, he will lay its foundation, and with the loss of his youngest son, he will set up its gates. So the Lord was with Joshua, and his fame was in all the land. Now, here's the thing about that. If you turn over real quickly to 1 Kings chapter, let's see, I think it's chapter 16. 1 Kings chapter 16. What Joshua says is it's not only the wealth of the city of Jericho that is reserved for God, but the city itself, the rubble of the city, in a sense, becomes its own type of memorial, its own sign of the day that God supernaturally intervened and made and gave Israel its first success in the promised land. So he makes a curse, and he says, anyone who attempts to rebuild this building, remember, this is not Israel's city. This city belongs to God now. He says, anyone who attempts to rebuild this city, they will lose their firstborn and their lastborn as a curse for the audacity of rebuilding Jericho. Well, flash forward generations, hundreds of years. We are now deep into the period of the monarchy, the divided monarchy. Old Testament history, there's Joshua, there's Judges. Judges covers about 270 years. After Judges, you have the united monarchy. You have Saul and then David and then Solomon. After Solomon, Israel and Judah divide into two nations, and you have what's called the divided monarchy. So we are hundreds of years in the future, well into the period of the divided monarchy. And in 1 Kings chapter 16, verse 34, there is a note here. It's during the reign of, it's talking about the reign of different kings, particularly Omri, who was not a good king. But in verse 34, it says, in his days, Hiel the Bethelite rebuilt Jericho. He laid its foundations with the loss of Abiram, his firstborn, and set up its gates with the loss of his youngest son, Segub, in accordance with the word of the Lord, which he spoke by Joshua the son of Nun. The language in the Hebrew of that verse suggests that what happens is this guy decided that he was going to rebuild Jericho. In a sense, here's a city with a foundation. It's strategically located. It's close to the Jordan River. It's got good water. There's a lot of potential here. And he sets out to rebuild a city, probably to name it after himself, because a worldly man looks at it as a good opportunity. There had been a curse on it since the day of Joshua. It had not been rebuilt for hundreds of years. But Joshua's curse comes through because what is implied here in the Hebrew, it says, he laid its foundations with the loss of Abiram, his firstborn. There is a real good chance that what that means is that this pagan, in an affront to God to rebuild Jericho, may have followed the typical practice of the pagan nations around Israel and Judah in those days, and he may have sacrificed his firstborn as an appeal to the gods to make the building project successful. Followed by what appears to have been the final setting up the gates, which would have been the crowning piece of the construction. In the process of setting up the gates, maybe in some sort of industrial accident, his youngest son, his lastborn, also dies, so that the curse hundreds of years earlier that Joshua spoke comes true. Why? Because Jericho belonged to God. Now, I wish we could stay a little bit longer. I was going to go through chapter 7. Because chapter 7 is related to the story of Jericho. But I tell you what, why catch up now? We'll pick up with Joshua chapter 7 tomorrow. The next segment, I think, goes through chapter 17. So tomorrow we'll do 7 through 17. But before you panic, remember what I told you last night. This is where we get into extensive chapters where it's really just the logistical recording of the distribution of the land. So you can read all of that. We're not going to cover all of those sections. We're going to focus on the battles. We're not going to focus on the administrative details, okay? But try and read through chapter 17, and we'll pick up with chapter 7 tomorrow. It is a follow-up to this Battle of Jericho, and it is another critical spiritual lesson, both for Israel and for us. Let me say a prayer. Father, thank you so much. You've given us this hour. And we have attempted to honor you by making use of it in a way that pleases you. Thank you for the guidance of your Holy Spirit, the way that you teach us as we present ourselves in your presence. Lord, may your word always be something that draws us, that appeals to us. Let us be a people who love your word, and not just the hearing of it, but who love the doing of it as well. Father, be pleased with Evergreen Church. In Jesus' name, amen.